Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Sedecase, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Today's episode is another very special one, as they all are, but this one's especially special. I say that every time, but they all are. I have with me Dr. Daniel J. Hill, and we're going to be talking about his co-authored book, "Does God Intend That Sin Occur?" It's really fascinating. And before you guys get out the heresy stamps or anything like that, just bear with us here. It's philosophically astute. It's biblically informed. We're going to get into the details for you. So just put the rocks down for a second and listen. It'll be great. Um, Dr. Hill is a senior lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Did his PhD under Paul Helm. I'm excited to jump in on this. So stick around, and you guys will be experts in the conversation on whether or not God intends that sin occur. Before we dive into the conversation, though, I want to thank everyone who's making this podcast happen over on Patreon. If you guys like this podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. I say this every time, so I'm sure that it just you're glazed over right now. But if you guys like it, you guys want to see me keep doing this stuff. I need more patrons. Please consider becoming a Patreon patron. I always feel like the WTTW or something like that. Like, it's brought to you by viewers like you. It actually is. So that would be hugely helpful. You can also buy some merch from my merch store. You can find the link in the description, or if you're on YouTube, you can find it just below this video. Super chats, through super thanks, all those good things. There's lots of ways to support the podcast. So please consider doing that. All right. Well, without further ado, let's get right into the conversation with Dr. Daniel J. Hill. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I've been an admirer of your show for a long time. You do tremendous work with some wonderful guests, and it's a great privilege for me to be a part of the series. And I also ought to say, before anything else, that the book that you've kindly asked me on to talk about today is co-authored. It's with my former doctoral student, Matthew J. Hart, and Matt certainly deserves at least equal, probably more than half the credit for anything good in here. But I take responsibility for all the errors.
That's great. Um, I I wanted to say a word about this Tyndale Fellowship. That
Mm.
you are the you're the chair of the
I'm the
study
coach.
group.
I'm the chair of the study group in philosophy of religion of the
There we go.
Tyndale Fellowship. That's right.
Yeah, and your
Um,
co-chair is Dr. Paul Copan, and we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to say his name before this. I'm pretty sure it's Copan, but I think that's his American way of saying it. So, can you tell us a word? Can you tell the audience a word or two about this fellowship?
I'd be delighted. It's a very important part of my life. It's something I regard as an important ministry. The Tyndale Fellowship is an evangelical study organisation in Britain. Originally, it was part of the InterVarsity Fellowship, as it used to be called, University and Colleges Christian Fellowship, and I know you have that in the States. Now it's independent of that student movement. The fellowship has got 6 study groups in Old Testament, New Testament, biblical theology, biblical archaeology, Christian doctrine, and philosophy of religion. And each group has got a chair and a co-chair. I'm the chair of the philosophy of religion study group in philosophy of religion, and Paul is the co-chair.
Hmm.
The It's unique in Britain in that it's the only evangelical philosophy society in Britain. I know in the States you have a wonderful and much bigger group called the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and that does absolutely tremendous work, and we're very much in awe of them over here in Britain.
Hmm.
But the Tyndale Fellowship is the nearest that we've got. It's much smaller than EPS, and we don't have our own journal in philosophy or anything like that. But we do have a conference every year, and your listeners and watchers would be very welcome to come to that. I can give you the web address if you would like for them to find out more about it and to
Yeah,
sign up for the conference and things like that.
yeah, that'd be
Um,
awesome. I'll put that link in
yeah,
the description here. Yeah.
great. Okay. It's just all we do in the conference is we have a set of papers, and anybody can give a paper, and we discuss them in the normal kind of way of a philosophy conference. It's all done in the name of Jesus Christ, but
Mm.
anybody can come along. It's not kind of restricted to Christians or evangelical Christians. We do have a keynote lecture every year, which is restricted to evangelical Christians,
Mm.
and I think the person that's down to be our keynote lecturer next year, who's called Paul Gould.
Oh, wow, awesome.
Yeah. So
Wow.
we're very much looking forward to welcoming Paul Gould to be our keynote lecturer in 2023. And in fact, Paul Copen is down to be our uh, keynote lecturer, the Tyndale Fellowship lecturer in 2024. So
Wow,
we're
okay.
very excited about that.
Yeah, that's huge. I'll have to check that out. I'm definitely looking forward to. I'm torn because I wanna give this information out there, but I also don't want competition for my paper submission. So, no, just kidding. I'll put it out there. Well, awesome, Daniel. Let's jump in to some of the
Sure.
details of the book. Does God intend that sin occur? Uh, Another link I'll put in the description is the link to the book because it's open access, so people can
It's
just
open
go and
access,
download
that's
this
right.
book. That's fantastic. And again, it's co-edited with Matthew J. Hart and Daniel J. Hill. Something about the J's there. You guys should have. That's good. That's the
Well,
factor there.
there's an American evangelical Christian called Daniel Hill,
Mm.
and so I put the J in my name because he might be cross if my stuff gets attributed to him. I wouldn't mind. I'd be flattered if people attributed his stuff to me, but I don't know whether he would reciprocate the sentiment. So I've put the J in to distinguish myself from him
That's
and anybody else called Daniel Hill
that's
around the
really
world.
good. Well, and that might be important because, like we've talked about off air, that this topic riles people up. Does God intend that sin occur? Um, I wanted to start by defining some terms. So maybe we might just say a word about like what do we mean by sin?
Mm, mm. That's a great question. Thank you, Parker. So we mean by sin, we're talking about sinful actions. We could have called the book, Does God Intend That Sins Occur? That might possibly have been a better title in some ways. But we're talking about the sinful actions, the sinful things that people do.
Mm,
Um, we're not meaning anything particularly heavy duty by it. For instance, sometimes you hear people say that a sin has to be directed against God Himself, so that it's not a sin if it's just directed against your neighbor. But we don't go in for any of that. A sin is just any morally wrong action that anybody does. That's all that we
yeah,
mean by it. With no kind of there's no hidden heavy duty theory or anything like that behind this.
that's good. Yeah. Just so would that I mean, does that also include mental acts too? Mental
Yes.
actions?
Yep,
Okay.
thank you for that. Yes, it includes mental sins, sins of omission, as well as sins of commission, and of course, more kind of straightforward physical sins of commission too. Absolutely. And
Okay.
in theory, it would, although we talk mostly about individuals in the book, it could, in theory, include sins of nations and organizations and things like
Oh,
that as
okay.
well.
So, yeah, I really like that you guys are doing that with this, like, this, broad, swath take on sin because so often there's a temptation, but it's also like a skill in philosophy to say like, here's just what I mean. It's this, and then it's like, well, what about all these other things that we typically take to be sins? And you're like, well, someone else deal with those. But this is like, no, this is just sin. What you take to be sin, it's pretty straightforward. These are all the sins that we're talking about. So I appreciated that in the book. So does God intend that sin occur? We got sins. What about intend? Like what can you help us out with intention and then like the difference between intending and having foresight of something?
Sure, thank you. So it's a similar story, really, Parker. Just as there are many philosophical debates about the nature of sin, so there are many philosophical debates about the nature of intention, and we don't get into any of them. We are using the word intend in what we think is the normal, common or garden, pre-theoretical sense of the word. People say things like, I intend to go to the dentist today, or maybe they say, I intend not to go to the dentist today.
Yeah,
And this is a normal kind of English word that's used a lot, and people don't seem to have any difficulty in grasping what it's meant. We take it that intentions are a mental state, though that's not actually essential for what we have to say. A lot of the older the word is relatively recent in the past few hundred years. Um, uh, Popular usage. A lot of the older texts, and we do talk about some of the older texts in the book, prefer the word will. So you'll
Yeah.
find, for example, that if you go back 400 years, they're talking not about whether God intends that sin occur, but whether God wills that sin occur. And we don't make any difference between those two. We would say that intention is not the same as desire. So we say in normal English, people say things like, I intend to go to the dentist today, but they don't tend to say things like, I desire to go to the dentist today. They might
Yeah.
sometimes say, but usually speaking, if you desire something, it's because you find it in some way attractive and good. And we're not saying that about God and sin at all.
Mm.
But in normal English, we intend, to, maybe very reluctantly, to bring about things that we'd rather not, like going to the dentist, and things that we wouldn't normally be said to desire. So we're not saying that God desires that sin occur. We're saying only that God intends that sin occur. By the way, it's we're quite careful in the book to say God intends that sin occur using a
Yeah.
that clause rather than something like God intends to sin, which we absolutely reject. So we
Right.
definitely don't say that God intends to sin. In fact, we say it's impossible for God to intend to sin. So we see
Yeah.
there's a huge difference between intending to do something and intending that something occur. And we're
Yeah.
talking only about the second of those. We're talking about God's intending that sin on the part of other people, that is, should occur.
Yeah. Yeah, that was such a helpful clarification when I was reading that, and as you just recounted. Um,
You wanted
so
to know about foresight as well.
yeah,
I
yeah,
haven't
I was just gonna bring that
gone
up.
to that
Yeah.
part. The uh, uh, we think, I think this is common sense. Most people that aren't trained philosophers and don't have an axe to grind here would say that there is a difference between intending and merely foreseeing. So, for example, when I drive my car, I foresee that I'm going to use up petrol, that I'm going to, or gas, as you call it in the United States, that I'm going to
Yeah.
wear down the tires, or tires with an I, as you call them in the United States. We spell it with a Y over here. I foresee all that, but I don't intend to wear down the tires. I mean, that would be a
Yeah.
very kind of strange thing to intend to do. Maybe, sometimes people do, but it's very, very rare. I don't intend to use up the fuel. Similarly, even in walking, I foresee that I'm going to wear down, my shoe leather, but I don't intend to wear down the shoe leather. Those are, I think, common sense type examples. There are more controversial examples that may well be familiar to your listeners and viewers. For example, um, in military ethics, uh, people will often say things like that a bomber pilot might foresee but not intend civilian casualties.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's not confined to the field of military ethics. And when the government builds a new motorway or freeway or highway, they, when they're planning it, they foresee, sadly, there'll be a certain number of fatalities, but they don't intend those fatalities when they are building the new motorway and freeway highway. So it does seem to us there's common sense distinction between intending that something happen and merely foreseeing that that thing will happen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I take it that, yeah, that a lot of Christians will say, yeah, God foresaw that it would happen, but he didn't intend that it would happen. And then there's even this distinction, again, that we already talked about uh, between desiring and wanting and intending, and then there's foresight. So, like, there's a lot of different options that people can
Yes,
take here. That
that's right.
God maybe foresaw it, but of course he didn't intend it, and of course he didn't desire it. But then the thesis of your co-authored book is that no, he yeah, he foresaw, but he intended, but he didn't desire, and want. It's perhaps he didn't want that. I believe you guys say like that's a different topic. We're not going to touch whether he wants or desires, though you do admit and like staunchly say like God can't sin, so God is not a sinner or anything like that. Yeah.
Right. So we don't say that God desires that sin occur. all we say is that God intends that sin occur. And of course, we also say that God foreknew that sin occur. Now, God foreknew that sin would occur is kind of fairly uncontroversial in the history of the church, because most people through the history of the church have affirmed that God's got total foresight. So
Yeah.
he knows everything that's going to happen before it happens. Now, some people have denied that more recently, the so-called open theists,
Right.
and there are a few if you go back in the history of the church as well, but it's very much a minority view historically speaking. Um, and we, of course, are affirming uh, not just contrary to the open theists that God foresees that sin will occur, because that's a relatively uncontroversial view. We're
Yeah.
affirming the much more controversial view in which the church tradition's been split, that God intends that sin will occur. Not just as church tradition been split, but we are quite open in the book about conceding that we're probably, numerically speaking, the minority side of that
Yeah.
tradition.
Yeah, so I caught that when I was reading, and I was like, "Oh, no," because everything you guys were saying was like, "Yeah, I agree with this, I agree with this," and then, "Oh, it's the minority. Oh, no, I'm in that." That's which is okay, you know? But, there's this I have to touch on this, and we don't have to spend a whole bunch of time, but, I loved the shoe analogy. It made me feel
Mm.
bad for my shoes. My dad bought me these really nice shoes, and I'm like, "Dang it, they're gonna wear down," but I'm not intending that. So that was fascinating. But this idea of intending to arrest Mr. Hyde, and
Yeah.
also, that intention then, like, I don't know if it transfers or it's transitive or something to arresting Dr. Jekyll, even though you don't know. Can you help us think through that, how, like, that intention works?
Yes. Well, this shouldn't make a difference actually to the final thesis of the book,
Right.
but we do discuss this for the sake of completeness, and this is why we talk about intending that um,
Yeah.
sin occur, because we think that the use of the that clause brings maximal specificity.
Yeah.
That is to say, we think that, to pick up on the example of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, though the same example will work with kind of Superman and Clark
Yeah.
Kent, we think that it's possible to intend that that Mr. Hyde be arrested without intending that Dr. Jekyll be arrested, even though you can't arrest the one without arresting the other because they're the same person. Or to put
Right.
it in um, DC Comics terms, you we think it's possible to intend that, um, let's say, that Clark Kent be sacked from his job as a reporter without intending that Superman be sacked, even though, since Clark Kent is Superman, if you sack the one, you sack the other. Now,
Yeah.
the tricky thing is that true not only of intend that blah blah blah, but is it true when you intend to do something? So without the that
Mm.
bit in. And
Oh, yeah.
now, when we say this shouldn't matter for the thesis as a whole, but we say that the when you bring the that clause in, it creates what philosophers call an opaque context into which
Yeah.
you can't substitute um, co-referring terms like Superman and Clark Kent or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because you've created this new kind of sentential or propositional context that is an entire unit, and you can't change things in that unit, even with co-referring terms. But by
Yeah.
contrast, we say, and again, it doesn't matter particularly if your audience doesn't agree with this, but we say that intend to, as a verb, doesn't have that feature. So if you intend to arrest Mr. Hyde, you also intend to arrest Dr. Jekyll. And if you intend to sack Clark Kent, you also intend to sack Superman, because that's just the way that the language works.
Yeah.
Um, Now, actually, if you didn't agree with that, that would make our job easier, because we've deliberately, you may have heard this phrase, to steel man the opposing thesis,
Yeah.
and we're trying to do that here. So we're deliberately adopting the kind of most restrictive, the worst case scenario for ourselves, and then we're very
Yeah.
careful to try and put everything in the intend that formulation in the book, so that people won't accuse us of pulling a fast one and trying to take
Yeah.
advantage of the what we say is a transparent context of intend to arrest Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, or intend to sack Superman or Clark Kent. So um, that's why we're putting it in the that clause the whole time, in order to give ourselves the toughest possible job to make sure that people can't accuse us of taking shortcuts. But as I say, if
Yeah.
your listeners think, no, 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 intending to arrest Mr. Hyde is a totally different thing from intending to arrest Dr. Jekyll, then in a sense they've actually made our job easier. But
Mhm.
for the sake of people that don't take that out, it's probably best if I carry on in this video for talking about intending that such and such.
Yeah, no, I think that's super helpful. And anyone, even like vaguely familiar with Frege paradoxes will find, or hooded man, or there's
Right,
deception
right.
cases. Um, that stuff's fun. So I like, again. So you guys use pre-theoretical definitions, and you use like the worst case scenario for yourself. All this is great. It's great like tactics to use in philosophy, um, because you're not trying to hide the ball or anything like that. I really appreciate that. Um, well, let's jump in on like the just a brief overview of the debate. We've already kind of broached the fact that this thesis is a minority view in church history. I think we should probably start with Augustine and his distinction
Mm.
between evil and the existence of evil. Can you help us out with that?
Well, again, this is us steel manning the opposing view, and if you like, taking the worst case scenario for our point of view. But
Yeah.
Augustine makes a distinction between sin and the existence of sin. So Augustine says, and I can actually read out the quotation if you think that would be helpful for your listeners. But Augustine says um, that God, here we go. Let's just see if I can find the um,
Yeah,
exact.
I've got one here too as
Yeah,
well.
go on.
The one
You
that's
read out your version.
okay. Yeah. So nothing therefore happens but by the will of the omnipotent. Per-
Mm,
he either permitting it to be done or himself doing it. Nor can we doubt that God does well even in the permission of what is evil, for he permits it only in the justice of his judgment. And surely all that is just is good, although, therefore, evil, insofar as it is evil, is not good. Yet the fact that evil as well as good exists is a good. For if it were not a good that evil should exist, its existence would not be permitted by the omnipotent good, who without doubt can be as easily refuse to permit what he does not wish as bring about what he does wish. And that's Augustine. I don't know if that was the same
great.
quote that you had in mind.
No, yeah, that's right. Thank you very much for that. So the Augustine distinguishes between sin and the existence of sin, and he says God can't cause God doesn't will sin, but he does will that sin exist. And this is then picked up with Aquinas later on. So Aquinas says, opposing what we've been quoting from Augustine, Aquinas says, God neither wills evil to be done, nor wills it not to be done, but wills to permit evil to be done. So Aquinas starts off by saying, God neither wills evil to be done. And we say that God does will that evil should be done
Yeah.
against Aquinas. Um, but we want to be clear that, and Augustine and people, even the Protestant tradition that follow, like Jonathan Edwards, for example, are clear that there's a difference between um, sin, which is bad, and the existence of sin or the occurrence of sin, which can be good in the greater context. And
Yeah.
we think that's a very that could be a very important distinction. Of course, if you don't grant that distinction, then actually it should be easier for us to argue for our thesis from the biblical passages. But if you do grant that distinction, then we need to do a bit of extra work to try and show that God does will that sin should be done. Um,
Yeah.
but yes, uh, uh, we think that the distinction, while it's not essential to our work by any means, is prominent in the historical discussion of the case, and that's why we kind of flag it up really in what we
Yeah.
say. Would you like me to say a little bit more about the way that the tradition split, Parker?
Yeah. Well, really briefly, you were saying that if this distinction doesn't hold, then the case is made even more readily or easily from the text of Scripture. So, like Aquinas, so Augustine has this distinction: sin's bad, sin's existence is not necessarily bad, based on like the context or what God's using it for. Maybe Aquinas says Aquinas, I believe, still upholds the distinction, but says both are bad, but permitting
Both are bad.
is not bad. But then people like Arminius, I think, would say the distinction is not there. There is no distinction. I- is that right? Does that sound like Arminius?
It is like Arminius. Actually, we have a quotation from Arminius in the book. Let me just see if I can turn it up um, to, um, to read it out. There's actually an index in the back of our book, which is um,
Okay.
uh, helpful, but Arminius features quite a lot in it. So um, trying to find um, the right quotation is a little bit tricky.
Yeah. Yeah. No problem.
Um, hang on a moment.
Hmm.
Okay, so this is what Arminius says. Um, okay, here's a actually let me just back up a bit.
Yeah.
The um, the quotation you gave from Augustine was a very good one, Parker, but there's actually an even better one. So just
Okay.
back up and give you the better quotation from Augustine, and then I'll give you Aquinas's take on it, and then Arminius's take. So here's
Okay.
the best quotation which Augustine gives. Okay, he says, although therefore evil, insofar as it is evil, is not a good, yet the fact that evil as well as good exists is a good. So that's the clearest place where Augustine draws distinction. So your example before was great. This one's even clearer actually. Now then Aquinas
Yeah.
then picks up on that and he says, some have said that although God does not will evil, yet he wills that evil should be or be done. So some have said is Augustine, but he doesn't actually name it here. Because although evil is not a good, yet it is good that evil should be or be done. This they said because things evil themselves are ordered to some good end, and this order they thought was expressed in the words that evil should be or be done. Okay, that's Aquinas's line. So as you say, he doesn't um, reject that distinction, but he affirms that God neither wills evil nor wills that evil be done. And now you
Yeah.
wanted to know about Arminius. So Arminius says, talking about the fall, which is of course a preeminent example of a sin, he says, for they, these are his opponents um, in the tradition of Augustine, distinguish
Yeah.
between the fall and the event of the fall. They say that God willed that the fall should occur, but did not will the fall should occur, but did not will the fall. The
Yeah.
distinction is verbal and not real. He who willed that the fall should occur, willed also the fall. He who willed that the fall should occur willed the event of the fall, and he who willed the event of the fall willed the fall. That's Arminius's view. So he tries to collapse the distinction.
Yeah.
Um, uh, Now, from our point of view, say this doesn't matter. We definitely don't want to say that God wills sin or intends sin to cure simplicity like that, because Augustine and people like that would be very upset with that.
Yeah.
But we want to say the other half of the divide, which is that God wills or intends that sin occur, and that's what we think can be demonstrated from the scriptures.
Yeah.
So that's so we wouldn't regard Arminius's um, attempt to collapse the distinction as kind of threatening our project at all.
Oh, so it doesn't threat. Is that because he's wrong, or is that because even if you do collapse it, it's no problem, like based on the text of Scripture?
Well, that's a good question. We um, um, there's the scriptures say that God does not sin. Okay,
Hmm.
that's very clear, but they never say God does not will sin or God does not intend sin, and they
Yeah.
never say, of course, God does not intend that sin occur, or God does not will that sin occur. So, we are. Um, uh, so, if Arminius thinks, "Ha, I can disprove this view really easily because the
Yeah.
Bible teaches um, God does not will sin, or God does not intend sin. Therefore, I can disprove by that view, the view that we're putting forward, which is God does
Right.
not, that he can disprove the view that God does will or intend that sin occur." Then Arminius, even if um, the we were to grant him the collapse distinction, he still doesn't have the biblical proof that God doesn't will sin or God doesn't intend sin. Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
I'm careful to put that in the negative, Parker, that
Okay.
the Bible doesn't say that. I mean, it doesn't have the biblical proof because, as I say, we are very careful in the book not to kind of annoy Augustine's followers. We don't commit ourselves to Augustine's distinction, but we certainly don't
Yeah.
reject it either. There is, I mean, um, there's obviously a distinction between intending or willing to sin and intending or willing that sin occur, because
Yeah.
we definitely deny that God intends or wills to sin. Okay, and
Yeah.
it's easy to think, of even normal examples in the world. Right, the mafia boss wants to keep his hands clean or her hands clean, so he or she says, "I will that my subordinates do the murder," and he or she doesn't will to murder him or herself, because the whole point is that they want to keep their hands clean. So
Right.
we're quite used in normal life to making that distinction between willing that somebody else do something, perhaps on your behalf, and willing to do it yourself. Okay,
Yeah.
that's very important and a natural distinction that we make every day. Um, but
Yeah.
we just to say it again to make sure that all your listeners and hearers get this clearly. So we
Yeah.
absolutely 100% emphatically deny that God ever wills to sin. We 100% emphatically deny that God intends to sin. What we're saying
Yeah.
is that the Bible teaches that God intends that sin occur on the part of other people.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so helpful. This is why I love philosophy. Just it's really, I can see a listener being like, this is just pedantic and taking the Arminius line and saying like, no, this distinction is not real. But you have to make that argument. You can't just say like, no, it's not real, because they are two different things. Because they do, even have like, they pick out different contexts, opaque or transparent, and it's fun to be like, this is what's actually going on, and you have to make an argument. You can't just wipe it off that easily. So I think that's really helpful distinction. It's also helpful to note uh, that this is found in Augustine, who, like, universally almost is respected amongst the Christians and the Christian tradition, and not just that dirty Calvin. Like, though Calvin agrees with Augustine, I found it fascinating as you guys are going. We don't have to go through the full list of theologians, but we talked about this a little bit off air, that Francis Turretin came along and said, Calvin wasn't quite right on this point, and so. There are going to be listeners who are many listeners will be taking the Arminius line, but then others, even in the Reformed circles, would be like, "That's Calvin might have been wrong here. Look at, even Turretin said Calvin was wrong." Um, can you just recount that for us real quick about Turretin, his disagreement? Did he really disagree with Calvin on this point?
Sure. Well, thank you. Yes. Just so let me add very briefly before we go on to that, the other reason why we would never say God wills or intends sin is because it's ambiguous. Okay. I mean, it's
Ah,
unclear what it exactly means. Just like, if I intended that my son marry, is it true to say that I intend marriage? Because I don't intend to marry. I intend that my son marry. But does
uh,
that mean, is it then true to say that Daniel Hill intends marriage on the part of his son? Well, to say he intends marriage is vague or ambiguous. we don't like vagueness and ambiguity. We obviously we
Yeah.
can't avoid it 100%, but we try as hard as we can to avoid it. And so that's the other reason, not just to keep Augustinians happy, but also because we think that the phrase is very unhelpful because it's so vague and ambiguous. So that's the other
Yeah.
reason why we'd never say God intends sin or God wills sin. Okay,
Yeah.
yes, the view that we defend is put forward by Augustine, Luther, Calvin, Maccovius, Perkins, Bain, Edwards, Tucker, the New England theologians Arthur Pink, and a contemporary theologian that some of you, your listeners, may have heard of, called John Piper. But we're
Hmm.
open that it's opposed by Aquinas, Baxter, Turretin, Arminius, Quenstead, Charnock, and Benson, and many others as well that we don't list. And it's in the Roman Catholic tradition, they tend to follow Aquinas, and so it's very, very rare to find a post Aquinas Roman Catholic figure that will agree with us. Though, in fact, Lombard, this is a pre Aquinas thinker, says, for it is clear that God acts in the hearts of human beings, inclining their wills whithersoever he wishes, either to goods out of his mercy or to evils. So
Mm.
he says, Lombard says that God inclines the will to evil.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Turretin, about whom you're asking, he never, of course, says, because he's very reverential towards John Calvin, he never says Calvin says this and he's wrong. So he never mentions Calvin by name, but he does give the opposing view, and he has quite a complicated um, way of putting it. Let me see if I can find a um, a nice quotation from Turretin.
Mm.
Um, let's see. Um, page 10. Okay. He says, God, therefore, properly does not will sin to be done, but only wills to permit it. That's
Hmm.
Turretin's view. So
Yeah.
he thinks God wills that he should permit sin, but he does not will or intend that God does not will or intend that sin be done, be
Yeah.
committed
And that
or
sounds
any of
just
the
like
actions.
Aquinas, right? That's like what,
Yes,
you know.
yeah,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is, and
Okay.
I think Turretin's well aware of that, and he sees himself as following Aquinas rather than Calvin in this
Okay.
area. And I think if you kind of got him up against the wall, which of course would be very easy for you, Parker, to do with your jiu-jitsu skills, then I think he would say something like, "Oh well, Calvin was being a little bit imprecise. You know, you can't blame him. He was so busy, he's writing so many commentaries. But strictly speaking, he didn't get it quite right." It'd say something like that. Maybe I should read out some of the Calvin bits just for your listeners and
Oh,
viewers,
sure.
because
Yeah.
um, he says. He says, God wills that the perfidious Ahab should be deceived. And he says, it would be ridiculous for a judge only to permit and also to decree what he wishes to be done. So God decrees that Ahab should be deceived. And of course, deception is a sin in Calvin's view, indeed in our view. And then he also says, it offends the ears of some when he said, God willed this fall. But what else I pray is the permission of him who has the power of preventing and in whose hand the whole matter is placed, but his will. So Calvin thinks, and Turretin doesn't go along with this, but Calvin thinks that if God willingly permits something, that's the same as to will it. And so
Yeah.
he actually says, God wills the fall. And again, we don't like the noun phrase there. We prefer to say God wills or intends that the fall should occur.
Yeah.
But Calvin just says God wills the fall here, and I say Turretin is more nuanced and would say no, he doesn't will the fall. He wills that the fall should occur. Would be what Turretin would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
sorry,
This
no,
is
that's wrong. That's wrong. Sorry, I messed that up. Wouldn't say that. He would say that, strictly speaking, he did not will that the fall should occur. We say that God willed that the fall should occur, but Turretin says God properly does not will sin to be done, but only wills to permit it. So Turretin
yeah.
says God willed to permit the fall, but he did not will that the fall should occur. So we say both. He willed that he should permit the fall, and he willed that the fall should occur.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good distinction and important. There's a like a I don't know if it's tangential or just like if it's closely related or not, but even in intending that the fall should occur, I think there's
Yes.
different ways like we're also not getting into like the manner in which God wills or like the
Right.
mechanism by which he's willing. It's not like if God puts an evil desire in your heart and that's how he's intending it to happen, well then yeah, maybe there's some like culpability that is, transmitted back to God or something. But that's a different question. We're not talking about like the
Yes.
free will mechanics of what's going on right now.
Right.
Just that he
So we try
intends
to
that
keep that
it does
open.
occur. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. You
Yeah.
finish what you'd say.
No,
Yeah.
I just think that that's important. Yeah.
No, it is important. Thanks for raising that, Parker. So yes, we're explicit in the book. We're trying to keep it as open as possible. We're not trying to pick fights. We've already got enough on our hand with the fight about whether or not God intends that sin occur. So we don't. We're very clear that we don't get into the debate about, for example, whether God causes that sin occur. And in fact, everything in the book should be acceptable to a Molinist, for example,
Huh.
rather than a Calvinist. I mean, I'm a Calvinist, and my co-author Matt is also a Calvinist, um, but we don't presuppose Calvinism in the book.
Mm,
And as I say, a Molinist can say, "Look, God didn't cause Adam to sin, but he put Adam in a position in which he knew he would freely sin." And this is the
yeah.
key point: the Monist can say God intended that Adam should sin.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
and they could say that about everything that we say in the book. Really, they could say yes, we agree with everything that he'll have to say, but we would add that it comes via this particular um, way of bringing it about, which is the weak actualization of Molinism, rather than what other people might say. In fact, what we ourselves would say, the authors, that God brings it about without um, depending on a free will that he doesn't cause
Yeah.
to take the particular line it does.
Yeah. Amen. Well, okay, so we're gonna get into some biblical texts here, for the more biblically minded who are saying, what the heck? I clicked on this link, and you guys are still not getting into the Bible. How dare you? We're gonna get there. And Daniel even suggested that we go there before some of this other stuff, so it is my fault. But you guys who do listen regularly know who I am and know what I like. So I I like the Bible, but I want to get some tools in place for us to be able to think through it. So
Mm.
real quick, before we're going to get into Exodus 4:21 and Romans 9:21 through 24, but before that, there's a couple different hooks for us to hang
Yeah.
stuff on, which I would like to get
Yes.
into. So, just you guys give this like more formal propositional form, I guess, of the argument or the thesis statement or something. It's P star. We don't have to get into
Yeah.
all the different P's and how we're getting to the star, but God chooses to bring it about that a sin occur in order that a state of affairs that can obtain only in virtue of the sins occurring should obtain. So
Yes.
that's where we're going. That's like what we're going to be looking for and stuff. Um, maybe just a word about like the bring it about relation.
Yes.
Can you help us with that?
Yes, thank you. I'm grateful that you've drawn attention to that. Again, we don't really mean anything very particular by bring it about. We've chosen that so that the Molinists can sign up to it if they want
Yeah,
to.
yeah,
So we didn't. It doesn't have to be full-on causation, which is what Calvinists typically would say it is. Um, but and of course, there's also this debate, which is going to be very important actually, that you can't cause sin because sin is an absence. That's what many
ah,
people in the tradition believe. So we want to allow for that as well. So that's why I use the bring it about locution. To explain the state of affairs that can obtain only in virtue of sins occurring, the reason why we're looking for this is because we think that's the best evidence that we can find in the Bible that God intends that sin occur. If
mm,
God chooses to bring it about that a sin happen, you could say, well, it's true they choose to bring it about that a sin happen, but he didn't um, intend that the sin should happen. He just chose to do this action by putting Adam in the Garden of Eden, which the monist would say, with the
Yeah.
consequence, the foreseen consequence that the sin would follow on. But he didn't intend that that sin should follow on. Somebody might say
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So, in order to try and refute that view, that objection to us, what we're looking for, Parker, is a case where God chooses to bring it about that a sin occur, and the reason why he's bringing it about, his intention in bringing about that sin occur, is that a further state of affairs should obtain that can obtain, logically speaking, only in virtue of the sins occurring. Right? So he
Right. Right.
needs the sin to occur.
Yeah.
And what we're going to say is that that is the best evidence that he intended that the sin occur. He wanted to bring about a state of affairs that needed a sin to occur.
Yeah.
He did bring about that state of affairs, and he intended to bring about the state of affairs. But then he knew, of course, that the sin was necessary for it. And we say that's very strong evidence that he intended that the sin should
Yes.
occur. So to put a bit
Yeah.
of flesh on the bones, suppose, for the sake of argument, suppose God intended, and in fact desired as well, um, that he should forgive us. Well, logically speaking, you can't forgive somebody unless they've actually sinned. If they're
Yeah.
sinless, it's impossible to forgive them. So if the Bible says God chose to bring it about that we sin in order that we might be forgiven, we say that's strong evidence that God intended that we sin, because
Yeah.
the only way to get to the desired and intended ulterior goal of forgiveness, the only way to get there is through sin, the occurrence of
Yeah.
sin.
Yeah.
And God knows this, of course, because he knows everything. So we say that's strong evidence that God actually intended that the sin should happen. Just like my ulterior goal of having nice teeth, a goal is a bit far off for me, but my intention and my goal that I should have nice teeth means that I need to intend that I go to the dentist, because I know that the only way for me of getting to the goal of having nice teeth is by going to the dentist, and that's why I intend to go to the dentist. Now, no, we say it doesn't follow from that that I desire to go to the dentist, that I regard that as a nice and good thing. It's necessary, and I do it because I know it's necessary, and I intend that I go to the dentist because I know it's necessary in order to achieve my ultimate goal of having nice teeth. Now, in that particular case, of course, it's not logically necessary, it's just causally necessary for me. Now, God, because he's omnipotent, isn't bound by causal necessity. But
Mhm.
most people in the tradition, apart from Luther and Descartes, have said that God is, um, a, that not bound by the laws of logic, but he certainly always abides by the laws of logic. Let's put it like that to avoid using the word bound, and
Yeah.
and
Consistent to his own
therefore,
nature. Yeah.
because this is his own
Yeah.
nature, there's a big debate here about the best way to put it. But he certainly also abides by the laws of logic, and therefore, if it's um, if it's logically impossible to achieve this state of affairs, the ultimate goal, without sin, then God has to bring about sin, that sin occur in order to get to the goal. And we say that's very strong evidence that he intends that the sin should occur, because that's the only way of getting his ultimate goal. So in that example of forgiveness, absolutely impossible without sin. So if God wants to bring about forgiveness, then he's got to bring about sin, or at
Yeah.
least I say bring about sin, but remember I'm trying to allow Molnists to sign up to this as well. So something like God has to do an action such that he foresees that the current sin will be an inevitable result of that action, something like that.
Yeah. I think that's really helpful. And going back to that shoe analogy
Yeah.
that we mentioned prior. So in that analogy or in that scenario, whatever it is, metaphor, whatever, you have these shoes and they're new. They got new soles, and you have foresight that, like, if I keep wearing these, especially if I wear them over there on that rough ground, then the sole is gonna wear out, but I'm not intending that they wear out, I just have foresight to it. However, in a different scenario where you, you wanna go in disguise, incognito, and you wanna look, like you have, poor person shoes or something that whatever, you're in a play or something and you want a scuffed up shoe, then you're actually, that's this end goal, and you are intending that your shoes will be worn down, not
Right.
in and of themselves, but for this purpose of something
Yes,
else.
that's right.
And so that's more of this scenario where, yeah, God has
Right.
to intend that sin occur because there's a either subsequent, good or antecedent
Right.
good or something like that. Does it That's a question about.
I'm very grateful to you. Sorry to interrupt, Parker, but
Yeah,
that's a
please.
really important point, which I should have said before, that we're certainly not saying, of course, and we emphatically deny that God intends that sin occur as an end in itself. Absolutely
Right.
not. Whenever God intends that sin occur, He's always got a good ultimate aim beyond that, like forgiveness, to go back to that example, for which
Yeah.
the sin is a necessary, a logically necessary precondition. The occurrence of sin is a logically necessary precondition.
Yeah. So that was a point that I was getting to about, um, whether the whether there it needs to be a greater good, or whether it's like just a subsequent good that, like, couldn't happen unless. Do do you guys mention, whether or not it has to be like an overriding good or a greater good or anything like that?
We don't mention that, but certainly would affirm that it would have to be an outweighing good. Yes. So in other words,
Outweighing good.
and that God um, never would intend that sin occur for a lesser good. Right. The good
Yeah.
of, to go with this example, the good of forgiveness would have to outweigh the badness of the sin in order to be worth it. And certainly, God, being perfectly good, would never do it for an unworthy goal. So, yeah,
Yeah.
all God's goals um, are as worthy as can be, um, and we've got a lot views on this actually, but all God's goals as worthy as can be, and certainly anything that God brings about in pursuit of those goals is justified by those goals. It would just be plain immoral for God to bring about an evil that was not justified by his goals, and being perfectly moral, God couldn't do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a helpful point. I think you're right there, and we don't have to spend too much time on this or anything, but I like pressing back on the libertarian free will defense, from the Arminians, because that is a greater good defense as well. Like, there's this greater
It is.
good and that is free will, and usually they don't
Yes.
like the greater good thing. They think, oh well, you're committed to consequentialist ethics or something like that. It's like, well, s- tu quoque, dude. Like, so are you guys. So, this is something that all of us have to wrestle with. I think, unless show me that I'm wrong, listener. But yeah, that the greater good thing is like a thoroughly Christian response. I think so. Um,
And it doesn't
before
commit
okay,
one to consequentialism either. I mean, it's a
yeah,
consequentialism thesis. Consequence of the thesis that um, the primary locus of moral appraisal is in the state of affairs, the consequences of an
yeah,
action. Okay,
yeah,
and nothing that you've said, and nothing that I'd want to say in explaining a greater good theodicy uh, would entail that, two quite separate theses. And of course, there are it there are some things maybe that are well, maybe, okay, let's just leave it at that, because otherwise I'm going to open a whole can of worms. We're never going to get to our Bible passages, so I better not say any
yeah.
more.
No, that's good. That's good. Yeah, we might have to come back on and talk about that more. One of my former professors, John Feinberg, always wanted to, Dr. John Feinberg, just poke me with that, like, oh, I think you're a consequentialist, even though he's a Calvinist himself. The way he worked things out was different, and so I'm still triggered by that, Dr. Feinberg. Um, So, one more thing before we get to it.
Yeah,
This is FM Cams, Francis Cam,
yeah,
gives these counterexamples to means and reasoning, and
Right.
just raises this principle of triple effect. And as you
Yeah.
guys said in the book, this is really complex stuff. Maybe we could just like
Yes.
kind of wave at it before we jump into the text.
Sure. The okay. So um, the we in the book, Matt and I discuss two possible alternative strategies in opposition to us. And the reason why they're strategies is they're philosophical theses that could be used against us in all these biblical texts that we discuss. So they're kind
Yeah,
of like a master strategy that will tell you how to interpret any given Bible verse against our interpretation, which we think is the natural interpretation. So one
yeah,
is Francis Cam's view, and Francis Cam's, what listeners of yours don't know, she's a contemporary philosopher. She's still alive and working in at Harvard, and she has argued very persuasively, we think, that there's a difference between acting intending that a certain consequence should result on the one hand and acting because that consequence should result on the other. Now, again, I
yeah.
should say this is us steel manning, if you like that word, the opposition. If you don't agree with Francis Camp, that's just going to make our job easier.
Mm,
But because this is an opposition um, to us. But she says that you can perform an action foreseeing that a certain result is going to arise and act because that result is going to arise without intending that result. So here's the example
yeah,
which we give in the book. I'll put it, I think perhaps easier for me to give our own version of it rather than her version. I can give you her exact
sure.
words if you want. So here's her example. Suppose I want to host a party in order that my friends and I might enjoy ourselves. That's the goal here, the ultimate goal. I know, however, that the party will produce a mess. So that's the foreseen bad side effect, a mess.
Yeah.
And the mess will ruin the party so that none of us will enjoy ourselves for long. So that's another foreseen bad side effect consequent on the mess. Okay.
Hmm.
This is a defeater for my plan. It's sufficient to dissuade me from hosting the party. So there's a problem here. The foreseen side effect is so bad that it means that the goal is not worth it.
Yeah.
But then I realize, she says, that the friends that I invite would surely, on account of their own good naturedness, feel indebted to me. And that's another bad thing. Feeling indebted, Cam says, and we agree, is a bad thing.
Mm,
So this looks like it's another foreseen bad effect. And consequently, feel obliged to help me tidy up afterwards. So now this is a good effect that's
hmm.
emerging from a foreseen bad effect. This is a defeater for my defeater, so I plan to host the party after all. In such a case, I intend to host an enjoyable party, and the bad effect of my friends feeling indebted to me is necessary for me to accomplish this, right? So it's a
Yeah.
necessary means to her end or goal. When I invite my friends to return, however, this is the key point, it does not have to be my intention in doing so that they feel indebted.
Mm,
My intention can merely be that they attend the event. I simply foresee that by inviting them, I shall also bring about their feeling indebted to me, such that they will help tidy up. We might say that even if I don't invite my friends intending that they feel indebted and so help clean up, I invite them because they will, out of their feeling of indebtedness, help clean up. As Cam puts it, it's important to distinguish between doing something in order or intending to bring about something else on the one hand, and doing something because of something else that will thus be brought about on the other hand. Okay,
yeah.
so that's Cam's revolutionary proposal. And as far as we can see, for 1,000 years, well, certainly for hundreds of years anyway, before Cam, everybody had assumed that you had to intend the foreseen means to your end. Okay. If you foresaw that something was a necessary means to your
Hmm.
end that you were bringing about, then you had to intend it. And Kant and many other people just absolutely explicit say, oh yes, this is obvious.
Yeah.
And until Kant, everybody seemed to accept this as obvious, and Kant disproves it. Now, as I say again, this is a kind of steel manning the opposition view, because if it were true that you had to intend your foreseen or foreknown necessary means to your end, we'd have a very easy job, because we
Yeah.
think it's quite easy to show that the occurrence of sin is a necessary means to certain ends or goals that God has in Scripture. Okay,
Right.
and so it'd be a much shorter book in 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 that eventuality. But
Yeah.
as I say, we're still manning the opposition, giving ourselves the worst possible situation to defend ourselves from, and so we're not assuming that it follows a matter of logic that if you foresee that something's a necessary means to your end, you have to intend it. Okay.
Right.
We're not assuming that, which makes our job more difficult, because we have to try and prove not only that God foreknows that this particular means, the occurrence of sin, is a necessary means to his end or goal, but actually that he intends it as well. And that's why
Yeah.
the job's quite hard. Now, would
Yeah.
you like me to talk about the other kind of opposing strategy here, Parker, or do you want to ask any
Yeah.
more about Francis Cam's line?
No, I think that's great. That was really helpful. Yeah,
Okay.
let's jump into that, and then we can dive into the text.
Great. So the other opposing line that we have to guard ourselves against is what we call the substratum strategy.
Yeah.
Now, the substratum is just the Latin word for something that underlies um, a, a particular thing. And in this case, the particular thing is the action. Now, perhaps a way that I think might be helpful for your listeners and viewers to get into this is to think about the law. And in law, in both where I live and where you live, the law makes a distinction between what they still call in Latin the mens rea and the
Uh-huh.
actus reus. So, to take an example, to be guilty at law of murder, you need not just to do a physical action of killing, but you have to have a guilty mind, a mens rea as well, intent to murder or to do bodily harm. Now, the action of murder, therefore, legally speaking, is a complex thing. It's got two parts: a mental part and a physical part. And
Yeah.
the the physical part is the substrate or substratum of the mental part. Now, that's just an example to help people think their way into the distinction. What the tradition says against us here, and this is tradition that certainly Aquinas follows, and Turretin, to take the two people we're talking about before as well, and Arminius as well, very keen on
Yeah.
this tradition. So most of because I say Cam's point of view, nobody heard of it or thought of it until 30 years or so ago.
Right.
Because of that, um, historically speaking, all the objections are on this line, the substratum line, and they take um, that kind of example I've just given from the law and apply it to all sins. So every sin, indeed every action actually, but let's just think about sins for the moment. Every sin has a substrate, and they don't call this, but a superstrate, you could call it if you wanted to.
Yeah.
And the substrate is the underlying part of the action, and the other bit, what Aquinas sometimes calls the formal part of the action, the substrate being the material part. The formal part is what makes it a sin. So, for example, you know, if you've got, you might see, and this is quite a frequent occurrence, you might see, one person taking something out of somebody else's bag,
Yeah.
and you think, hang on, has that person committed the sin or crime of theft? Well, you can't tell just from seeing the substrate. You can see the physical action of taking the book out of the bag, but you don't know that a sin or crime has been committed until you know about the other aspects, the formal aspects of the action. For example, whether the person realized that it was somebody else's bag, whether it was a mistake, or whether they had permission to take it out.
Yeah.
So just seeing the physical action is not enough to know that a sin's been committed. So sins just like crimes at law, sins are complex things that have a substrate that is morally neutral, and on top of that, they have the formal aspect, as Aquinas puts it, which gives it the distinctive moral quality.
Yeah.
And the opposition to us argue here that in all the Bible verses that we will talk about, God intends that the substrate, the substratum, occur, but he doesn't intend that the formal side of things obtain, that it be morally bad. So to give an example that may be familiar to your viewers and listeners, if and this is an example that's actually been used on our side in the debate, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. But in the book,
Yeah.
we acknowledge that our opponents got a kind of possible response here. So in Genesis 50, verse 20, Joseph says to his brothers, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." And what is the evil? Well, it's that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery.
Mhm.
Okay. Now, um, how would on the face of it, it looks as though this is a great proof text for our view, Parker, because
Yeah.
um, because Joseph says, "You meant it for evil, and it was a sin. Selling someone to slavery is a sin.
Yeah.
So you sinned, but God meant it, the same thing, and meant here we say means intended or willed. God willed that it should occur for good." So the natural reading of the text, and actually we say it's the correct reading of the text, but the natural reading of the text is that one thing happened, a sinful thing, selling somebody into slavery. The brothers meant it for evil, and God meant that it should occur for good.
Yeah.
Now, you might think, whoa, that's good. We've proved Daniel and Matt's point. We've proved the book's thesis that God intends that sinful actions should occur. But we, again, still manning the opposition here, we say, well, actually not quite as fast as that, sadly for us, because this is where the substratum strategy, the substrate strategy can come in to help our opponents. And Arminius, for example, does explicitly say this. So the idea is God intended the substrate of the action. So
Yeah.
if you like, he intended the physical move of Joseph to Egypt. He
Mhm.
intended the brothers passing of money to the um, slave traders, and the slave traders the way around. The slave traders passing money to Joseph's brothers, and Joseph's brothers bundling Joseph into the slave traders' arms. He intended those physical movements, but he didn't intend their sinfulness. He
Right.
didn't intend that the sinfulness obtain. That's, in a nutshell, the response from the substratum strategy.
Yeah.
Now, one thing to say about this before we go on is that um, if some of your viewers, I know most of your viewers and listeners are well into philosophy, but I think a normal person, somebody that wasn't heavily into philosophy, might say, "Oh, that's kind of a crazy interpretation that God intended just the physical moves and didn't intend their sinfulness, right? The
Yeah.
Bible doesn't make that distinction there. And that's just a kind of crazy thing. Only a philosopher could have come up with such a crazy interpretation. I think that would be a natural response, and I think that should be a correct response.
Huh.
Um, so we do think the natural interpretation of that text is the one that we've said, which is that God intended that the sin occur, the sinful handing over of Joseph to the slave traders, he intended that the sin should occur for a good end, namely to save many lives. But because we are philosophers, we feel it's our duty to try and steelman the opposition, and we say yes. We can't disprove from the text. The text doesn't prove their point of view, our opponent's point of view, substratum strategy, but it doesn't disprove it either. Okay,
Yeah.
so yes, all right, you could say that God intended only the physical movements of the brothers, bundling Joseph in there and the physical movement of Joseph all the way to Egypt. He intended that all those occur, but didn't intend they be sinful. And
Yeah.
so you could, in theory, get out of it that way. And the reason why you could get out of it that way is because God's goal, getting Joseph to Egypt, doesn't actually require, logically speaking, that any sin occur. Okay. As a matter of fact, it did happen in a sinful way, but it could have happened differently. So there's no logical requirement here. And our
Yeah.
opponents, we think, will seize on this point and say, aha, because there's no logical requirement, it's perfectly sensible to say God intended that the underlying physical substrate occur, but he didn't intend the sinfulness of the action. So that's
Yeah.
the two strategies.
Yeah, that's helpful. And so like yeah, there God could have intended that that you crash a car into me, but it doesn't have to be that you did it out of murderous intent or premeditation. It could have been second degree or third degree murder or manslaughter, or you were texting, or you were drunk, or as long as what God intended was the car hitting me, but not the intentions of in your head or something. Does that sound right?
Um, that's not quite how they would put it actually in the
Okay.
history, but that's along the right lines. They would put
Okay.
it even more cautiously than you've put it, Parker. They would say that God intends the uh, all the um, material, as Aquinas' word, the kind of substrate part of the actions, but the only bit that he doesn't intend is the formal thing, which is what makes it wrong, the sinful aspect of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you describe as all that you can of the action without saying that it's sinful. All of that, they say, God intends that all of that should occur. There's only one bit left, which is the additional factor that it be sinful.
Yeah.
That, they say, God doesn't intend that that should obtain.
Yeah.
And we say, and this is where, say, we part company with Aquinas and Turretin and all the other people that I mentioned earlier, we say, no, the Bible teaches that actually God does intend not just that the substrate occur, obviously that, but not just that. He also intends, according to the scriptures, that the sinful aspect of the substrate occur as well. In other words, that the whole sin happen.
Yeah, and so what we'll be looking for then is a text where that sinful action is looks like it is intended by God for
Right.
a necessary, or necessarily for a
Yes.
greater good. Yeah.
Right.
Um, so I guess that also just like limits the scope of the project too, and it's not that every sin has to be like that. It could be that like maybe some, I don't know, maybe some do follow a substrate view, but if you can point to one that is clearly looks like God is intending the sin as well, then there's at least one, or there's at least two. So, does that factor into your uh, joint thesis here that God intends that sins occur? It's not that God does it have a universal scope, and is it referencing every sin?
Right. Thanks. That's a great question. So no, we're careful when we set it up. So the question of our title is: does God intend that sin occur? And we actually put it in the singular, although sins could have been better in some ways, but worse in other ways. And the singular is there because it's enough for our thesis that God intended of only one sin
Right.
that it occur.
Yeah.
Okay, because Aquinas and Turretin, etc., they all say no. Absolutely, it's a hard universal negative.
Yeah.
There is never any sin. In fact, there never could be any sin such that God intended that that sin occur. They're very
Yeah.
clear and emphatic on this. Now, as a matter of fact, we don't say this in the book, but as a matter of fact, Matt and I do hold the opposite view, the universal affirmative, if you like, that for everything that occurs in the world, God intended that it occur. So
Yeah.
every single sin that occurs in the world, we say God intended that that sin occur. And in fact, every aspect of everything that occurs in the world is intended um, that it should obtain by God. So that the sin should happen in this particular way God intended that that occur. And it's worth perhaps just taking a moment here to do something we didn't do in the book, which is to say that, you know, um, we can see that this might be very upsetting for people that have been grievously sinned against, right? If
Right.
somebody's really suffered at the hands of somebody else, they might, at first instinct, say, that's terrible, that God intended that that person should sin against me in this horrible way. But we actually find it comforting, this view, because we think it's more comforting to believe, yes, God intended every detail of what happened to me, even though it was terrible. He intended all the things because he had a good purpose for every
Right.
single detail. So not
Yeah.
a single second of suffering is wasted.
Hmm.
Every single second of anybody's suffering is being used by God and was always intended by God for a greater good, an outweighing good. And we actually find that a comforting view. And in fact, we would find the other view that some kind of sins are kind of outside God's control or plan in some way. Um, our opponents would probably say outside a plan rather than outside his control, but that that God didn't plan for this to happen. On somebody might at first find that comforting, but on deeper reflection, we actually find that not comforting
Yeah.
because, you know, why then there's no rhyme or reason to why it happened. And that's profoundly uncomforting if you
Yeah.
think, this terrible thing happened to me for no reason or no
Hmm.
purpose. And we actually think it is incredibly comforting and helpful to know that even the most terrible things that happened in the history of the world happened for a purpose. And of course, one of the things that we do discuss in the book is the most terrible event that did happen in the history of the world, which is the crucifixion of
Right.
the Lord Jesus Christ. That's the most sinful event that ever happened in the world. And we maintain that the scriptures teach of that very example, that God intended that it happen. And of course, he intended it to happen for a very good end or goal,
Yeah.
namely the salvation of many people and the glory of God's name in the enlargement of his kingdom and the winning of many people to form a church as a bride for his son.
Yeah.
So, if that's true of the most terrible and wicked thing that ever happened in the history of the world, then even stuff that the scriptures don't talk about, we say that we can be confident in saying that they also are intended. God intends that they occur, and He intends that they occur for great good.
Yeah, even while not knowing what those goods, are,
Right,
you can just reason
right,
it, and you could say, "Well, it's warranted,
yes,
justified, whatever," because if he can do it with the worst, then he can do it with lesser, like the evil that I experience in my own life. And I'm
right,
with you 100% on that. I know some people might follow like, Peter Van Wagen's, free will defense, and there's random evil that's distributed randomly, and to me, I'm like, "Man, that just sounds rough," and it seems like it exacerbates the problem of gratuitous evil. Um, they have ways of getting around it, but I'm with you that it's more comforting to say like God has a reason for it. It's in His power. Um,
right.
let's
Just to be
let's
clear,
let's
I'm not
yeah.
saying sorry, just to be clear, I'm not saying, Parker, and I want your viewers and listeners to hear me clearly this, that I'm not saying it's true because it's comforting. I
All
think it's
right.
true
Yeah.
because it's what the Bible teaches. But I
Yeah.
also think it's comforting. Okay.
Yeah.
And Peter's view, Peter van Emmergen's view that you've just described, that there are evils for which there's literally no explanation. God doesn't intend that they happen, and he permits them to happen in some sense, but there's no rhyme or reason for it at all. I think that view is disproved by the scriptures, but
Mm,
also I think that's profoundly uncomforting, that view.
right. Right. Yeah. That's good. That's a good qualification. I appreciate that. All right, so let's jump in. We're at the biblical text now, finally, for everyone. Yeah, Exodus 4:21. I'll just read it out real quick, and then we can jump in. And the Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles that I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go." Boom.
Thank you. So we talk about a lot of Bible passages in the book, and the ones about hardening are really central for our purposes. Um, and this is a kind of classic example. It's much discussed in tradition, and we think it's pretty clear. So the key point here is that God hardens his heart, Pharaoh's heart, okay, and that means that he's making him sin, or is, if you don't like the word make, he's bringing it about that
Yeah.
Pharaoh sins, okay, because Pharaoh does all these terrible, sinful things, saying no to Moses in particular when Moses once says, "Let my people go." So Pharaoh sins, and he sins as a result of the hardening of the heart. And that's what the hardening of the heart means. It produces sin. And we're told in this verse, Parker, the goal or aim of the hardening of the heart, so that Pharaoh will not let the people go. And that's a sin.
Mm.
So God hardens the heart, he performs the action of hardening the heart in order that a sin should occur,
Yeah.
namely the sin of not letting the people go. Okay. And in fact, if we look on a bit, we actually find an explanation of why God wants Pharaoh not to let the people go. So the ultimate goal, this is from Exodus 9:13 to 16. Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, this is Moses, or God telling Moses what he's got to say. Let my people go, that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you yourself, that's Pharaoh, and on your servants, that's the Egyptians, and your people, so those are the Egyptians, so that you may know that there's none like me in all the earth. For by now, says God, I could have put out my hand and struck you, that's Pharaoh, and your people, the Egyptians, with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose, so here's the goal, for this purpose I have raised you up to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth.
Mm.
So God's ultimate goal here is that his name should be proclaimed in all the earth and that Pharaoh should see God's power.
Yeah.
And we know how God demonstrates his power. He does all the plagues, he kills the firstborn Egyptians, he parts the Red Sea for the Israelites, and then drowns the Egyptians in the Red Sea. Okay,
Yeah.
so um, they are punished. Okay, that's a punishment on Pharaoh. The plagues are a punishment on him for his sinful refusal, and his death and the Egyptians' death in the water of the Red Sea are a punishment on them for Pharaoh's refusal. Now, you can't logically punish somebody unless you think they're guilty of something, unless you think they've
Right.
sinned. And therefore, God, when he punishes Pharaoh and intends to punish Pharaoh, knows that he can't punish him without Pharaoh being sinning, without Pharaoh sinning, okay, because God, being perfectly just, couldn't punish somebody sinless, because obviously you know that they're sinless. So, how does God then achieve this goal of showing Pharaoh his power? He needs Pharaoh to sin in order to be able to achieve this goal. If Pharaoh had been sinless and God had put all these plagues on him, that would have been immoral. Okay,
Right.
wouldn't have demonstrated God's glorious name at all. It would have been immoral. So that's obviously impossible for God. So the only way he can do what he wants to do, show his power in the plagues and the parting of the Red Sea and the drowning of the Egyptians, the only way he can do that is if Pharaoh sins. Now, we know that God gets Pharaoh to sin. That's what we said before. I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Not letting the people go is a sin, and God says, I will produce it. I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that, in order that, he will not let the people go. So God's ultimate goal is punishing Pharaoh. In order to achieve that, he needs intermediate goal that Pharaoh sin. In order to achieve that, he needs to do the action of hardening his heart. So
Mm.
we say God intends all three of these things. He, according to this text, this is the natural reading of the text. He intends that he harden Pharaoh's heart. That's less controversial.
Yeah.
And secondly, he intends the result of his hardening Pharaoh's heart, namely, as it says here, so that in order that he will not let the people go. So he intends Pharaoh's sinful refusal. Obviously,
Yeah.
God knows that it's sinful. He intends Pharaoh's sinful refusal. and he intends Pharaoh's sinful refusal in order that he might justly punish Pharaoh and demonstrate his power in the plagues and the parting the Red Sea and drowning the Egyptians. So we say that this text, Exodus 4:21, teaches that God intends that a sin occur, the sin of Pharaoh's saying no to Moses.
Yeah. Does this I think it's so tough to keep keep the right keep the right conclusion in mind, that like this is speaking to the text, this is speaking to God's intentions, whether or not he intended evil, and all these other things jump in just right away, like, well,
Mm.
does that mean that God can does that make him the author of Pharaoh's sin then? Like, is he morally is God morally culpable? Can he actually hold Pharaoh morally responsible for the actions after he hardened him? And that's not really that's not what's in view here. There's I think there's a lot of different ways you could go about it. How did God harden his heart? Like uh, Kevin Van Hooser might say, well, he presented his goodness to him, but he didn't give him he didn't persuade him and didn't illuminate him. A Molinist might say, God, through his middle knowledge, knew what Pharaoh would do if given this reply via Moses. Like, there's a lot of different ways to do it, and to look at God's um, actions being right and continually holding Pharaoh responsible. But that's not really what's going on here, right? Like, we're just looking at the intention and the actual text. Does
Right.
that
So
seem right?
the text doesn't say how God
Right.
hardened Pharaoh's heart. And in fact, none of the hardening texts in the Bible ever says how it happened, how it works.
Yeah.
But they do say that hardening of the heart leads to sin. And then we
Mm,
see that in this example. And
yeah.
also in this example, we say this example shows that not only it does lead to sin, but it's intended that sin should occur as a result.
Yeah.
That's the key point. Would you like me to say a word or two about why we think Cam's approach and the substrat approach can't work here?
Yeah. Yeah. I think
Okay,
especially for Cam's view, because I was thinking
right.
maybe someone might go all the way to like God's name being known on the earth,
Mm,
and that would be like this primary intention, or that would be like the
right.
goal, and then the rest are just kind of, yeah. Yeah, I think definitely, especially Cam's, but both
Okay.
would be helpful.
Well, I'll start with the substratum because that's perhaps a bit easier. But so
Okay.
the substratum view we say won't work here because it won't do for God merely to intend that, you know, Pharaoh say the word no to Moses, or the Egyptian equivalent of the word no to Moses, without intending that he do so sinfully. And the reason why that won't work is because God needs that Pharaoh's sin in order to be able to punish him. Okay.
Yeah.
So he's got to have, um, it's got to be not just, and compare it with the case of Joseph. When we're talking about Joseph, we conceded, Parker, Matt and I conceded, that um, our opponents had a case here. The substratum um, approach had a case. We don't think it's a very good case, actually, but it is a
Yeah.
case because they can say, God intended only the physical movements of Joseph, and he didn't intend they be sinful. They've got no case at all here, we say, because if they say, oh, God intended only the physical movements of Pharaoh's mouth saying no,
Yeah.
well, that's not enough to justify punishment. But the whole point is God wants to demonstrate his name as a just punisher of sin.
Yeah.
That's why he does the plagues. That's why he drowns Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Okay, but obviously, if you're going to be a just punisher of sin, there's got to be sin. It's not enough just to intend the physical movement of the mouth, because that doesn't justify punishment. So
Right.
we say that the substratum line can't possibly wash here because that's a rather unfortunate phrase, maybe talk about drowning the Red Sea can't possibly wash. It's no good
Yeah.
here. Um, and we say it's no good because it doesn't do justice to the necessity of the sin for God's goal here.
Yeah.
Now, Cam wants to say that God intends that his name be proclaimed as the punisher of sin, and he knows that sin is a necessary means to that, and he actually does because, okay, it's going to have that effect,
Mm-hmm.
but he doesn't intend that it have that effect.
Yeah.
Now, what we say in response to Cam is um, God, being perfectly rational, never acts without an intention. Right? He doesn't do anything kind of randomly or whimsically or without intending something by it. I mean, that's to say, it's either got to be an end in itself or it's got a further intended goal. Now,
Yeah.
what's the intention of the hardening here? Well, certainly the intention of the hardening is not an end in itself, right? That would be immoral to intend hardening as an end in itself, because
Yeah.
hardening is a bad thing. So it's definitely not a goal in itself. But what then is the intention? Well, the ultimate intention is the um, demonstration of his power in all the earth as a just punisher. But how does God intend that this particular and why does he like? How does God intend that this particular um, action of hardening should produce the desired result? Okay,
Yeah.
what in God's intentions connects the action with the ultimate goal? Now, in the case of Joseph, you could talk there about something that did connect. God's ultimate goal there was that people should be fed, lives should be saved in the case of famine, and that in order for that, Joseph had to be moved from Canaan to Egypt.
Yeah.
Okay, so there, Cam could tell a story about God intending um, steps on the way that connect the um, first action of the movement of Joseph's body to um, Egypt with the ultimate goal of saving many lives.
Yeah.
But in this case, we say that Cam's approach doesn't seem to answer that question. It doesn't seem to explain how, in God's intentions, the hardening is intended to bring about the final result of um, the demonstration of his power as a just punisher. Now, Cam herself says you don't have to intend all the means to your goal, right? That's the key part of her view.
Yeah.
But she does say you have to intend something, right, to achieve your goal, because otherwise it's not, if you don't intend any means, then it's
It's
just
not
wishful.
rational.
It's not
Yeah.
intending.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
you've got to intend some means to your goal. Otherwise, it's just a hope or a wish, not an intention.
Yeah.
And here we say that um, the text doesn't hold out any way for Cam to say that there's a means that's intended by God to bring about this um, um, to bring about this ultimate goal of
Yeah.
his name's being um, demonstrated in all the world, other than the one that we actually say. Now, maybe it might be better to talk about some of the actual tests that Cam puts forward. So she gives 3 tests, which she takes from Michael Bratman, for intention. So
Okay.
she says, if we intend to bring something about, this is test 1, we seek means to accomplish the end of bringing it about. Now, look at this case. We say that God intends that Pharaoh's sin of saying no to God occur. So does that pass this test? Does God seek means to accomplish the end of Pharaoh's saying no? And we say yes. In fact, Pharaoh says no multiple times, okay? and God actually
Mm.
hardens his heart multiple times in the text.
Yeah.
Okay, so we say yes, God certainly does seek means to accomplish the end of bring it about that Pharaoh sinfully say no. Second thing, if we intend to bring something about, we pursue it. That is, if one way fails to produce it, we adopt another way. This is really key, a really key test here. So suppose that Pharaoh had um, had you know um, been about to say no in some kind of non-sinful way. Maybe like he didn't understand the request. Okay, so
Yeah.
he said no because of a mistake. So it wasn't a sinful refusal. He'd misunderstood what was at issue. Right? We say that. I mean, it's a bit hard to imagine, but we say in that case, for sure. I mean, the Bible doesn't actually say this, but we say this is implicit in the storyline. For sure, yeah, God would definitely have um, made the request absolutely clear to
Yeah.
Pharaoh, so that Pharaoh would know that he was going against God. In other words, doing something sinful. And we say that because it's crucial for God's purposes, in order that his name be known as the just punisher of sin, that it's a sinful refusal of Pharaoh. So if um, God had, when God was considering how shall I bring about this state of affairs of my name being proclaimed as a just punisher of sin, he weighed up the various options, and if a way that had that didn't produce the sinful part of it, we say he rejected that for that very reason. He
Yeah.
adopted the other way of making Pharaoh act sinfully in order for this very um, goal of his name being proclaimed as the just punisher of sin, his power being demonstrated in the punishment of sin, in order that that should obtain. And we say that, although the text doesn't actually say this, that Cam's second test from Bratman, that if one way fails to produce your goal, you adopt another way, that this passes that
Okay.
test. Okay,
Yeah.
because certainly God and Moses would have um, well, I shouldn't bring Moses into it. Sorry, that God would definitely have, um, I've tried another way, and of course he does try time and time again with Pharaoh. Gives him lots of chances, plenty of rope to hang himself with, you might say, and we say that
Yeah.
he does that because he's wants to produce. He intends to produce that this intends that there should be produced this sinful action. And the third test that Cam discusses is this: if we intend something and our intention should be consistent as far as we're rational, then we will filter out intentions that conflict with intending it. And we say that it also passes this test. Again, this isn't in black and white in the text, but we say that it's certainly consistent with the storyline that God doesn't have any contrary intentions, and there's nothing in the text that says that God tries to um, God intends that Pharaoh shouldn't sin. Okay,
Right.
he God's omnipotent. He certainly could have stopped Pharaoh from sinning, and in fact, if you go back to the um, Exodus 9 passage, God says in verse 15, "For by now I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people peasants, and you would have been cut off from the earth." So this is before the parting of the Red Sea and all that. So God could have sorted out the whole business ages ago.
Right.
And we say that the reason he didn't is because he's building up Pharaoh's sinfulness in order for the justice of his punishment to be displayed.
Mm.
Now, has that helped in trying to explain why we think the Cam reading is not a persuasive reading of the text? I mean, I'm sure the opponents could say more here, but I don't. I'd like to be able to go on to the New Testament text as well, so I don't want to spend too much
Yeah.
time on it.
Well, I think that is helpful, and let's go on to Romans 9 because it also
Yeah.
talks about hardening and stuff, and so
Yes.
we can double down on it even in the New Testament text as well.
Would you
So
like
I
me to
have
read this
Romans
one?
9.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, if you want to. If not, I could do it either way. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll read it then. So I'll start at verse 15. So this is Paul writing, he says, for he, that's God says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion. So then, it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God who has mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So then, he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is moulded say to its moulder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honourable use and another for dishonourable use? What if God, desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he's called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles? So that's verse 24. So what we say about this text, Parker, is this. So God's ultimate goal here is in verse 23, to make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy, and that's Christians. Now, how does he bring about that goal? Well, the text says, it says, God desiring to show his wrath and to make known his power. Now, what is he doing when he's desiring to show his wrath? Answers, enduring with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Now, God's wrath, Parker, is not like our wrath, right? Our wrath might be unjustified against people that haven't sinned. God's not
Right.
like that. His wrath is only ever against sinners. So if God desires to show his wrath, there's got to be sinners, because he can't show his wrath if there's no sinners, because that would be immoral and therefore impossible.
Yeah.
So God has, the previous verse explains this, he's made out of the same lump, the lump of humanity, one vessel for honourable use, that's the elect or Christians, and another for dishonourable use. That's what theologians call the reprobates, people that aren't Christians and never become Christians. So that's the vessel for dishonourable use. And the vessels for dishonourable use are the same as the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction. And
Yeah.
the vessels for honourable use are the same as the vessels for mercy, Christians. So the point here, we say, Parker, is this, that God intends that the vessels of wrath sin in order that he might destroy them and make known his power and show his wrath on them. And that's also seen in the previous paragraph, which harkens back to Pharaoh, where it
Yeah.
says, Paul quotes Exodus, and he says, the scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I've raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So Paul's saying here, and of course it's all inspired by God, so God's saying it too.
Yeah.
Paul's saying that the same goes for Pharaoh as goes generally for the reprobate,
Yeah.
the people that aren't elect. They've been raised up, as the word in Pharaoh's case, or made in verse 21 out of the same lump, endure with much patience, in order that God might to show his wrath and make known his power. Now, again, the wrath demands logically sin. So
Yeah.
it follows that God has, we say it follows that God intends that the sin occur in order that he can achieve his goal of um, showing his wrath. And the vessels for dishonorable use, dishonorable, you can't use something dishonorably, or at least God can't use something dishonorably if it's sinless. Right? You can only
Right.
use something dishonorably. God can only use something dishonorably if it deserves to be dishonored. In other words, if it's sinful. So we see when he says about the vessel for dishonorable use, that is a sinful vessel. And it's one that's made by God. So he's made a vessel for honorable use, made another for dishonorable use. So we say, and this is what back in verse 20, when the objector says to Paul, why have you, well, the objector says to God, and Paul reports him saying this, why have you made me like this? Now, and who can resist his will? So what the objector's saying there is, why do you find fault with me? Why does he still
Right.
find fault? Well, that means find fault with me as a sinner, right? That's what finding fault is. For who can resist his will? So he means if God wills that I sin, I can't resist it. And then he says, why have you made me like this? Meaning a sinner. That's what's in
Right.
view here. So the text here says that God makes people sinners. Why have you made me like this? Okay. It's his will that they sin, because it says, who can resist his will? And the reason why he wills that they sin is in order that he can show his wrath on them, because God can't show wrath unless they've sinned. So we
Right.
say that God intends that they sin in order that he can show his wrath, in order that he can make known the riches of his glory for vessels of mercy.
Mm.
Now, as that help why we maintain what we have, would you like me to talk about how the substratum people and cam fans might respond and why we think that isn't going to work?
Yeah. So
Okay.
real briefly,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, if someone might respond and say, "Well, Paul says, what if?" So,
Right.
we can even be inerrantists and
Right.
fallibilists, but still recognize that what
Yeah.
if this passage has is just Paul giving a hypothetical? Well, what if?
Right.
And perhaps it's not. Yeah, what do you make of that? Just initial
Right.
retort.
Thanks. That's a great question. We talk about this in the book. So you're absolutely right. The text doesn't say this is definitely the truth.
Yeah,
It says what if, but it's still it's important to recognize that even the questions in the Bible, like this one, are inspired questions. Okay, they're
yeah,
not just random things. Sometimes, occasionally, you hear people talk as if only the declarative sentences in the Bible are inspired, and the questions could be totally random. They can't be
right.
totally random. They're all inspired by God, so they all make sense in the context, right? They're all questions that are worth asking.
Yeah.
Now, it wouldn't be worth asking if um, if it were totally off the wall stupid, right? I mean, imagine this,
Mm.
Parker, right? On our opponent's view, they might say, when Paul says, what if God, desiring to show his wrath to in its powers, endured with much patience, vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? They might say, yeah, but, you know, what if he can't? So there's an end of it, right? That can't possibly be right. It can't possibly be the case that when Paul says, "What if somebody said to him, yeah, but that's just impossible?" He said, "Okay, you're right, it's impossible, but I was just talking about an impossibility." That would make
You're
no
right.
sense at all in the
Yeah.
text, right? The point in this text is that this is something, a possibility that's compatible with God's nature, right? If it were an
Yeah.
impossible situation that were incompatible with God, it'd be ridiculous to mention it, and the Bible doesn't say anything ridiculous. It doesn't even ask ridiculous questions, right? The questions
Mm.
are all there for an important purpose.
Yeah.
Now, that's all we need, okay? Because of course our opponents say that God can't intend that sin occur. Okay. And we
Yeah.
say that this passage holds out the prospect that for all we know, it's true in real life that
Yeah.
um, God has set things up like this. So maybe if I wanted to be ultra cautious, Parker, what I would say is this passage teaches that for all we know, God intended that these sins occur. Um,
Yeah.
Now, I think I can be a bit stronger than that, but our opponents certainly can't accept that because they are saying, Aquinas and Turretin and so on, saying, no, the Bible teaches the opposite. It teaches that God never intends that sin occur. And in fact, God can't intend that sin occur. We know that. So
Yeah.
this passage is certainly a huge problem for them. But I actually think that linking it back to Pharaoh, which is not a what if case, but this is a real life case where Paul says, for the scripture says to Pharaoh. So he's quoting the absolute 100% authority of God here, the scripture says. And the way he links that with this possibility, if you want to use that word,
Yeah.
um, seems to me to indicate that, you know, actually this is reality as well as possible for all we know,
Yeah.
because of the way he links it with something that is real. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, the certainly it's still a problem for even if I'm wrong about that, even if we're wrong about that, it's the Bible's certainly holding us out as true for all we know. Otherwise, the
Yeah.
opponent could just say, "Well, we know that's wrong, Paul." End of discussion. So it's true
Right.
for all we know, and our opponents deny that, and there's the problem.
Yeah. Wow,
Did
that's a really
you want
great
to say something
response.
about Cam and the? Sorry, go on.
Yeah, yeah, that's an amazing response. Let's go with, I guess you know better than me, to pick whichever one you think comes more naturally first, substratum or cam, and then
I
close
think
it out.
Substrata comes more naturally first, and then
Okay.
Cam follows on the back of that. So, in the book, we combine them into a combined SaaS strategy and talk about that. So, a substratum account, again, we think they've got no case here, and the reason why they've got no case is because um, it's not enough for God to intend that the vessels of wrath um, perform the substrate of the sin, because he desires to show his wrath and to make known his power. And if, going back to that kind of silly example I gave before, if somebody had just done the, um, let's go back to the Joseph example, on silly example. So the Joseph example, it makes sense. We actually don't think this is the right interpretation of the text, but it makes sense. We can see what they're getting at for our opponents to say God intended that the body of Joseph moved from Canaan to Egypt, but he didn't intend that it be sinfully sold into slavery.
Right.
But here, there's no parallel move that they can make, it seems to us, Parker, because the whole point here is that God wants to show his wrath, okay, and being perfectly moral, he can't show his wrath unless there's sin, and
Right.
that's the whole point of a vessel for dishonorable use, and that's the whole point of why does he still find fault, right? Fault is sin. We're talking about sin. So it seems to us that it's very clear here that when he says, "Why have you made me like this? With what intention have you made me like this?" Meaning a sinner. The What God goes on to say is, in the text, what Paul goes on to say is, the intention that God had is in making you a sinner is that you should be a vessel for dishonorable use, in order that my wrath, says God, might be shown upon you. In order that, this is the good goal at the end of it, the riches of my glory for the vessels of my mercy might be made known. Okay, so we think the
Yeah.
substratum approach doesn't get off the ground here. Now, Cam's
Yeah.
approach, again, is just like in the X passage, harder to refute. We certainly grant that. It's a very subtle, difficult view, but again, we think it's not plausible about the text. And we might add here, Parker, that something we say in the book, that it kind of seems a bit odd for somebody to say, nobody understood the Bible properly until Francis Cam came along in the 1990s and suddenly explained it all to us. Okay,
Yeah.
but before then, for 1,900 years or so, everybody had been misreading the Bible. They'd
Yeah.
been assuming that this was a case of means end reasoning and that you had to intend the means. But now it's suddenly revealed by Francis Cam that you know this is a different kettle of fish. It's a matter of because of the means, not intending the means. It
Right.
just seems kind of implausible that this view would never have occurred in the entire history of the church. Francis
Yeah.
Cam isn't in the church, but it would never have occurred before now. And actually, as far as we know, Matt and I are the first people ever to apply this view to this text, okay, or to
Yeah.
any of these texts. And we're applying it on behalf of our opponents
Right.
to try and steelman their position. But okay, here goes. So what Francis Cam might say here is this. She might say, God intends the just punishment, the showing of his wrath on the vessels of wrath, the vessels for dishonorable use, but he doesn't intend the means, that is, they're actually sinning. We say, again, going back to those three tests
Yeah.
that Francis Cam herself quotes, that she takes from Michael Bratman. So first test, if you intend to bring about something, you seek means to accomplish the end of bringing it about. Well, we say that's fulfilled in the text here because God actually makes them like this. That's what the object says. Why have you
Mm,
made me like this? So you
right.
couldn't really find a clearer example of God's choosing the means to make somebody a sinner. He's made them like this, right? And
Yeah.
when he says like this, he means made me a sinner. That's what the objector's saying. That's the first test. Second test, if we intend to bring something about, we pursue it. That is, if one way fails to produce it, we adopt another way. Well, again, this is hard to kind of imagine because God's ways never fail, but you can, um, you know, if um, Pharaoh, to go back to the example in Romans 9:17, when Paul himself is giving this example, that if Pharaoh or any other vessel for dishonorable use had kind of, um, uh, you know, wasn't sinning for some, uh, it's hard to imagine because God's made them that way and God's plans always work. But just imagine that you had some kind of open theist type view of God, as some people do, where his plans might fail. So in
Yeah.
that case, on this line, would God then, if he desires to show his wrath, would God take another approach to ensure that outcome? We say yes, just as he does in the Exodus account with Pharaoh, that he, you know, spends multiple times going to Pharaoh and multiple times hardening his heart. It's not just once in the Bible that it says that he hardens Pharaoh's heart, but more than once. And the third test is the if we intend something, our intention should be consistent as far as rational, then we filter out intentions that conflict with intending it. So does God have any conflicting intentions here? Does God intend that the vessels for dishonorable use should not be shown wrath? Does he intend that they should not sin? No, there's
Mm,
absolutely nothing along those lines here in the text. And again, we've got to ask, Francis Cam says very clearly that although you don't need to intend all your means to your goal, you've got to intend some means, otherwise you're just
right.
wishing or hoping for it.
Yeah.
So here the goal is showing wrath. And we said that because God's perfectly moral, that has to be on sinners. So what what on this view, the Cam view, would God intend to as his means to bring about the showing of wrath other than sin? Well,
Right.
we say there's nothing else in the text here at all
No.
that is held out as a means whereby God could constitute somebody wrathworthy other than sin. Okay, and not only does the text not show any other way, but we actually say there is no other way. The rest of the Bible
Right.
shows, we say, that God is wrath only on sinners. If you're innocent or you're forgiven, God doesn't show his wrath on you. That's really important for Christians. Okay, that's why we've got
Yeah.
such confidence that on the great day of judgment, we're not going to be subject to God's wrath because we've been forgiven and we have the righteousness of Christ. So
Right.
sin and only sin fits the bill here. It's the only possible means. So we say that um, on Francis Cam's view, if you were to adopt it with this passage, you'd be left with God just hoping, right? There'd be no means at all to
Yeah.
connect God's making somebody for dishonorable use and they're actually being suitable for the show of wrath and the making known of his power. And we say that the only link between those two is the sin that follows on from their being made for dishonorable use. And we
Mm,
say that because that's the only possible link, God must intend that link obtain. In other words, he intends that the vessels for dishonorable use actually do sin.
hmm. Whew, man, that's quite a case.
We've
That's
only
so
done
good.
two passages, and
Right.
we have. I actually haven't counted them up, but we're 14 or something like that in the book
Yeah. Right.
passages. Now, I've picked out what I think actually the two strongest here. I have to be honest, and we discuss some cases which we think aren't quite as good, and we say that, and we rank them
Yeah.
to strong, moderate, or weak.
Yeah.
But we've got several strong passages. I can let your readers know that we think they're Exodus 4:21, which we discussed today, Deuteronomy 2:26-30, Joshua 11:18-20, 1 Samuel 2:20-25, 2 Samuel 24:9-14, Ezekiel 20:25-26, Romans 9:22-23, which we just discussed, and then Romans 11:30-32. So there's quite a lot of other passages there we think are strong, and then we also talk about moderate and weak ones. It also ought to be said that we discuss other verses in the Bible
Yeah.
that could be put forward as objections to our our line, and we try and respond to them as well. And I can talk about
Yeah.
that now if you want, Mark, or if we're out of time, I can leave people to read them on the book, which is after all open access, so they won't need to
Yeah,
pay.
that's exactly what I was about to say. Yeah, so, folks, grab the book. It's open access. You can download it for free. The link will be in the description. It is Daniel's holding it up there, but it's "Does God Intend That Sin Occur" by Matthew J. Hart and Daniel J. Hill. The Palgrave Pivot book. So go, feel free. Please do go download that book. Um, I will also have a link to the Tyndale Fellowship study group for philosophy of religion there, and I'll have a link to Daniel's own website where you can find more of his works as well. Um, this has been so awesome, man. Thank you for all your time. We've gone over 2 hours now. This has been fantastic. Um, there's there's so there's so much more to do now, like with this tool and with this in hand. And Lord willing, it'll help people pick up His word, God's word, and read. So that's like the end goal. Always is to better understand God, to better understand our relation to Him, and yeah, what he intends with his story of reality. So Daniel, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man. This has been really, really fun.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm sorry that I've taken such a long time, but
No, it's
in
been
my
awesome.
defense, you've asked some brilliant questions, and I've been trying to make myself as clear as possible, because we definitely don't want to be misunderstood about this. We don't
Right,
want people
right,
saying, "Oh, they're saying God sins," because we absolutely deny that. We say
right,
God doesn't sin, can't sin, never sins, and so on. But also, secondly, we've got the utmost respect for the people with whom we disagree, right?
right.
We would never go against Aquinas and Turretin and people like that without really seriously thinking that the Bible pretty much forces us to do that. And that's why I've taken such length to try and show that we're not, kind of just trying to give some kind of half-baked response here that is just kind of casual reply to them, but we've thought and prayed about this a lot, and we are convinced that this is um, really the only vaguely um, appropriate and natural way to read and understand the scriptures. But thank you
Yeah,
very much to you for having me on. Thank you to everybody for listening, and I'm happy to, if people want to email me, then I'm very happy for them to do so. I'm happy for you to put my email address in the show notes or whatever as well, if people want to. As I put it in the chat for you, but if people want to contact me about that, I'll be happy to try and answer any further questions if I can. And if people can, as Martin Luther, said, if people can disprove me from the scriptures, then I'll certainly, be happy to recant all this. But it
yeah,
seems to me that there's just a clear teaching of the Bible.
yeah. Amen, amen, man. Thanks so much. My puppy Theophilus is going wild right now.
All
Folks,
right,
that's gonna have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.
amen to that.